So welcome back to another session. I think it's always like a really lovely occasion when we welcome back one of Penn's own PhDs to the material text workshop. So I'm thrilled that Marissa Nicosia is with us tonight. She received, I checked back, you received your PhD from Penn English in 2014 after earning her BA from Barnard College. And while at Penn, she wrote a terrific dissertation on the forms of literary history writing in early modern England, which she then transformed into her first book, Imagining Time in the English Chronicle play, Historical Futures, 1590 to 1660, which came out from Oxford UP in 2023. That book takes a historical formalist approach to this important genre, reading Shakespeare and others as part of an ongoing contest in the period, important for 17th century political transformations over how to think about time and how to write the history of the past, the present, and the future. It's an important book, not least for bringing Shakespeare's plays, which have really been the center of study of the history play in the period, into conversation with other forms of historical drama that have been very little studied, such as the polemical mini plays / political tracks of the Civil War period. And it was here on the 6th floor during her time at Penn that Marissa also began, as the kids like to say, to cook. That's a Gen Alpha slang. You don't know. Together with fellow grad Alyssa Connell, she began cooking recipes found in the archives of the Kissack Center and elsewhere to learn more about historical recipe culture, foodways, women's work, and also to eat some delicious Lockean pancakes with a million eggs in them.
And half a nutmeg.
And half a whole nutmeg. So that project has turned into a much-read website, Cooking in the Archives, that she continues to run, and a book in progress called Shakespeare in the Kitchen, which pairs recipes with readings of Shakespeare plays that those recipes can illuminate. And we're going to hear a bit of that tonight. I think the book promises to be a widely read public humanities monograph. And I think it will have some high quality, full color food photography.
Yeah.
Marissa's been a Mellon Fellow in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School. She's been the Panzer New Scholar from the Bibliographical Society. And she's been awarded numerous fellowships to aid her work, including from the Folger, the Clark Library at UCLA, the Huntington, and the American Philosophical Society. She's also a highly decorated teacher at Penn State Abington, having won numerous awards for her innovative pedagogy, which stresses the same kind of experiential learning that she practices both in her book historical and her cookery scholarship. Her essay on reading Spenser in 1648 was given the honorable mention for the Isabel McCaffrey Prize for Best Essay of the Year from the International Spenser Society. And I also want to mention she has an essay on slaveholding, seasoning, and the circulation of culinary knowledge in the Franklin Family Receipt Book, in the new book, American Contact, Objects of Intercultural Encounters and the Boundaries of Book History, edited by Raylan Barnes and Glenda Goodman, which has just come out from Penn Press, and which we'll hear more about on April 21st in a roundtable event. She's been up to much more than this, but I don't want to take away from her time telling us about and feeding us strawberry conserves. So please join me in welcoming Marissa back to the workshop.
Thank you for that introduction, Zach. I'm going to share my screen, right? Okay. Great. So thank you to Zach, Jerry, and John for the invitation to be back here in the seminar. Thank you to Peter for handling the logistics and answering my questions. And thank you to everyone on the 6th floor who makes research and talks like this one possible. The strawberries and honey bubbled in the pot and dissolved into a molten red jam. Smells of fruit and flowers filled the kitchen. I was stirring strawberries and honey to make a strawberry conserve. The plastic metal handle on the metal candy thermometer bent in the heat and broke off in my hand. I had first read the recipe to make conservy strawberries a few weeks prior in MS Codex 823 over in that reading room, and I was attempting to follow its instructions. It may not be immediately clear why I would do such a thing as part of my research on William Shakespeare's Othello, and in brief, that's what I will be talking about this afternoon. Why, how, and to what end I cook recipes as part of my research on Shakespeare's plays and poems. I am especially excited to be sharing this research in process here at the Seminar for the History on the Material Text, not only because I know I'm doing work like this because of my training at Penn and on this floor, but also because I think what I'm doing has purchase on how we think about materiality, embodiment, research practices, the division between the academic and the personal, and the question of what library collections can be for their users. And I'm not going to consider all of these questions in the next 40 minutes, but I did get permission to bring strawberry conserve into the same room as the manuscript from which I attempted to prepare it. The manuscript is not quite back in a kitchen, but I'm excited for this experience of adjacency, and I hope by the end of this afternoon you are as well. I'm just going to minimize this little sidebar here. All right. So here's where we're going. First, I'm going to say a bit more about how I came to write the book I'm finishing, Shakespeare in the Kitchen. And then I want to speak to some questions of method that I believe will be of particular interest to this audience. And finally, I will return to the case study of strawberries, the conserve in these jars, MS Codex 823 sitting in its foam cradle, and Othello also sitting here in a foam cradle. Okay, so Shakespeare in the Kitchen. I've been working with historical recipe manuscripts in a sustained way since 2014, when paleography practice as a grad student here at Penn grew into cooking in the archives, thanks to an interdisciplinary innovation grant from GAPSA. I collaborated with Alyssa Connell on this project for a few years and continue to run it on my own to this day. When a recipe piques my interest in the reading room or when I'm looking at digitized collections online, I transcribe it. I conduct research on the recipe's ingredients and methods. I prepare the recipe in my home kitchen in Philadelphia, and I document my recipe recreation process with photos and by writing an updated version of the recipe. There are now over 100 updated recipes from manuscript and printed cookbooks from circa 1550 to 1800 on the site. And more than 386,000 individual visitors have looked at the project page online. Esther Oresti's collections, donated to Penn, and her 1964 book, The Delectable Past, filled with lively prose and updated versions of historical recipes ready to cook, have served as an inspiration for my work since the early days. Oresti purchased the volume that is now MS Codex 823 in 1959. Oresti insisted that the historical recipes from her library belonged in the kitchen. She writes, "Old cookbooks make delightful reading, and I found old recipes easier to follow than some modern ones once I learned to ignore the quantities that were obviously meant to serve huge households." The serious recipes are intended to offer fresh and new ideas to the imaginative and sophisticated cook of today. Shakespeare in the Kitchen is a natural outgrowth of undertaking a decade of work on food history while also teaching Shakespeare practically every semester. The book asks what Shakespeare's works can tell us about early modern culinary recipes and what these recipes can tell us about Shakespeare's works through short chapters that include both analysis of his poems and plays and updated historical recipes ready for cooking. Through close reading and recipe recreation, I join a lively set of ongoing conversations about how Shakespeare's works reveal tensions within early modern food culture, about what to eat, who should eat, when to preserve foods, and how to serve meals for guests. As I prepare the recipes that permeate the canon, from Falstaff's beloved capons to the cakes that demarcate festivity in Twelfth Night, I demonstrate how the physical act of cooking can transform our understanding of once familiar texts. So my book is drafted and the recipes have been well tested by me as well as by my parents. But I'm revising it for final submission. So I'm still tinkering with the Othello case study that's coming up soon. And the book might be out later this year or early next year from Routledge's Spotlight on Shakespeare series, which welcomes somewhat experimental monographs like this one. As series co-editors John S. Garrison and Kyle Pavetti write, the aim of each volume is twofold: to show how Shakespeare speaks to questions in our world and to illuminate his work by looking at it through new forms of human expression. When they told me they were open to me including recipes and lots of images, I leapt at the opportunity to write this particular book. Penn materials feature prominently in this project for reasons both geographical and intellectual. Manuscript cookbooks that we can firmly date to Shakespeare's lifetime are few, and Penn has two, the two out on the table. Quite a few collections were published in print between 1570 and 1619, and I have consulted those resources extensively as well. But given the sea change in culinary ingredients and preferences over the course of the 17th century, I am wary of using isolated recipes from the 1670s to elucidate Shakespeare's food puns, even if cookbooks are especially retrospective as a genre. And I've kept my focus on the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The particular book that I'll be talking about more today, the one on the left up here, MS Codex 823, was created and used from approximately 1567-68 to 1600, and it contains a wide variety of materials. It begins with pages of Psalms, copied from a Bible or a prayer book, then a copy of the deathbed statement of Lady Catherine Grey, and finally a selection of medicinal and culinary receipts. This variety is not atypical, but here we do have this Lady Catherine Grey provenance, which is interesting. As the entry in the manuscript cookbook survey on this volume puts it, if this book was compiled around 1568, it is one of the earliest English manuscript cookbooks extant and predates all but the first three printed English cookbooks. I've also worked with materials from a few other collections in person and virtually: the Folger, Indiana University's Lilly Library, the New York Public Library, the Bodley, and the British Library that have these earliest books. And recipes from manuscript and print volumes from all of these collections inform my recipe recreations and feature in my chapters. But again and again, the Penn recipes made the cut in the kitchen, intended to serve as the anchoring recipes for each chapter of analysis. And how I do that, those questions of method are what I'll be talking about next. So culinary metaphor, cookbooks, and recipe recreation. Okay. What does a play know? What does a poem know? What does a recipe know? And what can I learn from reading, and what can I learn from making? These questions have guided my work on Shakespeare in the Kitchen. I make note of food words, cooking instructions, and culinary metaphors in Shakespeare's works. I investigate them by reading and print and manuscript cookbooks, and then taking promising recipes into the kitchen. The first port of call, if you are interested in food in Shakespeare, is Joan Fitzpatrick's meticulous, comprehensive Shakespeare and the Language of Food, a dictionary first published in 2011. Starting out with food references alone, I thought that I was going to write a chapter about figs in either Othello or in Antony and Cleopatra. But when I read the instructions to prepare and use strawberry conserve in the reading room, I immediately thought of Othello. In the library and at the stove, this is work that I have found intellectually challenging as both a scholar and a cook. When I share this work, it inspires both more excitement and more skepticism than my traditional literary scholarship based on close reading, historicist contextualization, and critical bibliography. I like this formulation of the problem that frequently comes up. In the opening pages of her 2023 book, Small Fires, an Epic in the Kitchen, Rebecca May Johnson writes, I am taught that the work of critical thinking takes place outside of the kitchen, and that cooking in domestic space is not connected to the endeavor of serious thought. It is an exclusion that has limited the shape of our ideas. So what is a scholar of cookbooks to do? Cooking, obviously, has always been a part of cookbook culture. Elaine Long's magisterial Recipes and Everyday Knowledge provides substantial evidence that recipe trials, through debates on paper and correspondence, edits and comments on the pages of manuscripts and printed cookbooks, and hands-on trials in the kitchen, brew house, or still room, were crucial to verifying culinary and medicinal know-how. She writes, more often than not, early modern recipe books are marked up, and compilers used their own customized set of signs and phrases to classify recipes and their stock of household knowledge. On the screen, one of my favorite examples. This is not a good cream. Wendy Wall and Pamela Smith's insights on making and knowing have also guided my methods. Wall places the practice of thinking in the kitchen with the pots and pans, and I'm drawing from these much longer quotes. And Smith describes the feedback loop between text and practice as an iterative circle of reading and testing, and reading again. I see my own recipe recreations as part of a long history of interpretation and adaptation linked to both current and early modern investigatory practices. Moreover, while we have normalized putting on productions of Shakespeare's Othello in 21st century theaters, food studies scholars remain unsure about preparing a Renaissance jam recipe in a 21st century kitchen. Ken Albala, an author of absolutely indispensable books on European food in the Renaissance, has published a few compelling and, to my mind, contradictory articles on this topic. In his 2010 article, Cooking as Research Methodology, Albala provides 7 case studies where recipe recreation led to new insights about kitchen labor, cooking tools, and recipe writing. He argues that the words of cookbook authors and food writers often only become meaningful when one follows their directions with ingredients, tools, and procedures that are as close as possible to the original. That is, to write intelligently about cooking practices and culinary texts, some cooking is logically requisite. He reiterates this point in a 2014 article entitled Shakespeare's Culinary Metaphors, a Practical Approach, and specifically claims that using historic equipment and ingredients to make recipes with which Shakespeare was familiar might lend insight into the meaning of the texts that would otherwise remain obscure or conjectural. Moreover, culinary historians might also make better use of Shakespeare to understand the prevailing aesthetic of the era. And he goes on in this article to present an absolutely killer reading of the funeral baked meats in Hamlet and the cannibal meat pies in Titus Andronicus in light of Renaissance pie preservation technologies. So remember that. Yet Albala also argues in that first article, adapting recipes in any way whatsoever tells us absolutely nothing about the past. It reveals only our modern preferences and prejudices. Or, to be blunt, the majority of historic cookbooks consisting of watered-down adaptations are completely useless for this kind of analysis. That is, the technology, the techne itself, must be as authentic as possible to gain any really meaningful insights. This applies to archaic spices, as well as to animal breeds that have by and large changed in the modern era. Where no direct equivalent could be found, the experiment could not be conducted, he says of his methods. Albala presents an impossibly high standard for authenticity here. Without a hearth and heritage ingredients, Albala posits we learn nothing from following the steps of a recipe. A hearthless scholar cook like me is left in a bind. While I have collaborated with Hearth Cooks, and thanks to Anne Muellenthaler for inviting me to Pottsgrove Manor back in 2023, that's where these photos are from, including of some lock pancakes that we made using a brazier of coals. So in most cases, and on most days in my kitchen, the experiment cannot be conducted according to Albala's standards. Consider, for example, the strawberries needed to prepare strawberry conserve for my case study. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, wild European strawberries were sometimes transplanted into gardens, and the name strawberries refers to the practice of using straw between and around these berries. European wild strawberries are a distinct plant family from the American wild strawberry, the Fragaria virginiana, and that is the strand that has been bred into modern commercial strawberries. It is thus impossible to source ingredients to test a 16th century strawberry recipe in 2025. It is not possible to purchase the correct berries at any shop in Philadelphia or even in England because of the commercial cultivars. And even if I wild forage strawberries in England, I'm not sure I could be really sure about the status of these varietals versus the 16th century varieties. And then we can talk about climate change. We can keep going. So I cannot access the flavor of a 16th century strawberry, but I can try to test other variables to the best of my ability. And I remain attuned to the practical, embodied aspects of what recipes ask their users to do. In this case, I can study the difference between preparing a recipe for strawberry conserve with sugar or with honey. Okay, and here we go. Strawberry conserve and Othello. Othello is not necessarily a play that is preoccupied with food, but it is certainly a play that is concerned with appetite. In the first scenes of Shakespeare's tragedy, we learn of a clandestine marriage, a promotion, a grudge, a hapless suitor. Othello, a celebrated general and a Moor of Venice, as the play's subtitle describes his blackness, has secretly married Desdemona, the white daughter of the Venetian senator Brabantio. Called to trial, Othello and Desdemona refute claims that their union is forged from witchcraft or coercion. Enchantment, charms, drugs, and magic are all invoked. Instead, Othello and Desdemona tell a story of Othello's storytelling. Gitanjali G. Sahani has persuasively argued that Shakespeare's devouring discourse in the play invites reading and spectating audiences to consume Othello's story like Desdemona once did, with a greedy ear. And I build on Shahani's insights in my own investigations of appetitive devouring in the play to show that it is not limited to, as she puts it, eating Othello or eating the other in some of her other formulations. During the Venetian army's military campaign in Cyprus, disgruntled ensign Iago stokes Othello's jealousy and leads him to believe that Desdemona favors Cassio. Iago posits that jealousy mocks the meat it feeds on and monstrously consumes the body that it inhabits. Othello first imagines Cassio and others tasting Desdemona's sweet body and subsequently threatens to cannibalize her as punishment for perceived infidelity. His exclamation, "I will chop her into messes, cuckold me," brutally reimagines Desdemona as a mess or meals served to soldiers. Emilia and Desdemona's earlier discussion of husbands prefigures this cannibal meal. Emilia insists they are all but stomachs and we are all but food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us. These are violent, all-consuming appetites. Shakespeare's play traffics in racist caricatures to link Othello's appetite, anger, and jealousy with his blackness. One way that it does this is by connecting Othello's emotions to his race, appearance, lineage, and country of origin. When Emilia, Desdemona's attendant and Iago's wife, inquires whether or not Othello is a jealous husband, Desdemona responds, "Who, he? I think the sun where he was born drew all such humors from him." Here, Desdemona invokes geohumoralism, an environmental understanding of race and temperament. In humoral theory, the dominant way of thinking about health, embodiment, emotions in Shakespeare's England, in that theory, the four humors are balanced in the body when things are going well: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. In geohumoralism, and my account here is drawing on Anya Lumba and Jonathan Burton's work with Jean Baudin's 16th century theories. So in geohumoralism, individuals who are born in specific regions of the world were thought to have temperaments that prepared them to live and thrive in the climate of their origin. Baudin writes that Southerners abound in black bile, which subsides like lees to the bottom when the humors have been drawn out by the heat of the sun, and increases more and more through emotions, so that those who are mentally constituted in this manner are plainly implacable. Lumba and Burton's gloss on Baudin's racialist thinking explains that he regards Southerners as more easily inflamed to passion, more jealous and sinful than inhabitants of colder northern climates because of this process of drawing out. So Othello is also inherently implacable or inconsolable. And here my reading concurs with some of what Gail Kern-Pastor, Mary Floyd Wilson, Michael Schoenfeld, and Gitanjali Sahani have all done with the humoral stuff in the play. Although we are never told exactly where Othello was born, language in the play consistently places him south of Venice, codes his skin as dark, and links him by turns to North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. The hot sun of Othello's unspecified birthplace, as Desdemona understands it, will have burnt away his inclination towards jealousy and inculcated a cooler, unsuspicious temperament. But according to Lumba and Burton's reading of Baudin, Desdemona has misunderstood. Following the sexist and racist logic of Emilia's original question, is he not jealous, both implies that Othello might be as jealous as any other husband, or he might be an especially suspicious spouse because of his origin in lands geographically south of Venice. Desdemona misreads Othello's humor when she imagines that he is less jealous than the average husband. In this way, Shakespeare relies on geohumoralism as a racializing frame for understanding disposition and appetite in this tragedy. As Othello's jealousy grows, Desdemona's strawberry-spotted handkerchief gestures to a remedy which could arrest this consuming cycle. The audience only learns of the existence of this significant cloth accessory when Desdemona loses it halfway through the play. The first time Othello sees Desdemona after Iago has made his insinuations, Othello then complains of a pain upon my forehead, and Desdemona tries to heal this pain by binding it with her handkerchief. He brushes away her hand with the admonition, your napkin is too little, and as they exit the stage, the handkerchief is left behind. Gathering up the handkerchief, Emilia explains that this is not any quotidian garment, but rather a love token. I am glad I have found this napkin. This was her first remembrance from the moor. My wayward husband hath 100 times wooed me to steal it, but she so loves the token, for he conjured her she should ever keep it, and she reserves it evermore about her to kiss and talk to. That Othello gave this handkerchief to Desdemona during their courtship is enough to make this handkerchief a special object. Emilia tells us it was his first remembrance, and Othello later reiterates, "'Twas my first gift." But Emilia's description alerts us to the strange power that this love token has accrued. Desdemona speaks to it, kisses it, holds it close to her body, and carries it on her person every day to reiterate her love for Othello. Echoing Brabantio's accusations that Othello used magic charms and drugs to woo Desdemona, Emilia uses the verb conjured, which has supernatural valences, to describe how Othello bade Desdemona to keep the handkerchief safe. Iago wants the handkerchief so much that he has nagged and implored Emilia to steal it. And Emilia does not know what Iago intends to do. Although spectating audiences might spot the strawberries on the prop handkerchief on the stage, reading audiences only learn about the fruit pattern stitched into the fabric from Iago. Later in the scene, when Iago begins to use the handkerchief as evidence of Desdemona's inconstancy in conversation with Othello, he asks, "Have you not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand?" And informs Othello that he saw Cassio wipe his beard with the same handkerchief that very day. Othello's jealous lament, "Oh, blood, blood, blood," frames his anger at the loss of this handkerchief in truly humoral terms. When Othello confronts Desdemona about the lost handkerchief, he weaves a story that further enchants the cloth token embroidered with strawberries. I have the whole exchange up on the slide, but here are the highlights of Othello's story in chronological, not narrative order. Sacred silkworms produced the silk that was woven into the handkerchief. It was imbued with additional magic when a sibyl, a 200-year-old prophet, embroidered strawberries on its surface with thread dyed with mummy. An Egyptian charmer gave this handkerchief to Othello's mother, a family heirloom. And while she possessed it, his father's affections were steadfast. While she kept it, 'twould make her amiable and subdue my father entirely to her love. If she had lost it, their marriage might have gone awry. She gave this handkerchief to Othello on her deathbed so that his future wife would always be faithful. And critics have spilled a lot of ink over this handkerchief and whether or not Othello's story is truthful or a convenient fabrication or many other things. The significance of the handkerchief is intertwined with the geohumoral logic of the play. As Ian Smith argues in his landmark article, Othello's Black Handkerchief, the black weave of the handkerchief stands in for Othello and the black fabric or makeup used in the performance of race on stage. He writes, this arresting color is a graphic reminder of the handkerchief's function as a visible metonym for Othello, the portable object that Desdemona carries around as a constant reminder of her Black African love. In her incisive new monograph, Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds, Amberine Dadaboy builds on Smith's reading by tracing the handkerchief's Islamic geographies, where it functioned as a sign of sexual desire and purity. In her reading, Shakespeare's choice to link this handkerchief with patriarchal concerns over women's chastity echoes early modern English writing about Islam more broadly. Dadaboy writes, no matter how much of an insider Othello may be, as the play's subtitle more of Venice exhorts, Othello's Moorishness as blackness and as a religious signifier problematizes his belonging. Of the handkerchief in particular, the prop, a remnant of Othello's pre-conversion life, manufactures Muslim identity in Othello, which explains his tyrannical and lethal misogyny. And this, in my words, racial and religious signification imbues the handkerchief with the power to alter Othello's humor. I'm most interested in the idea that the handkerchief can be a remedy for jealousy because of the mummy dyed strawberries. And it was dyed in mummy, which the skillful conserved of maidens' hearts. As Miriam Jacobson has recently written, the word mummy in the early modern period was most likely to refer to the prized medicinal ingredient in pigment made from ancient and not so ancient Egyptian mummies, parts of mummies, and pulverized powder made from desiccated, dismembered North African corpses. Again, like Dadaboy notes, we are traveling in Islamic worlds. In Othello, Jacobson writes, fresh mummy functions as a pigment to dye the blackwork embroidery threads, as well as an exotic and necromantic ingredient. As Gitanjali Sahani puts it, Othello's own insistence on the charms and subduing effects of the handkerchief dyed in mummy suggests that his own belief in the powerful transformative potential of exotic objects on subjects who possess them. I would build on these formulations by insisting that the fact that the mummy was conserved, prepared as a dye or a pharmaceutical ingredient from the hearts of maidens, embeds this handkerchief within cultures of health and medicine that follow geohumoral logic. The silk strawberries are intertwined with these conserved hearts. To make conserve of strawburrs, the late 16th century recipe for strawberry conserve that I was stirring on my stove as I was thinking through these lines from Othello is also a study in appetite, preservation, and healing. The recipe is in a section of the manuscript that includes many preserved fruits and flowers with various culinary and medicinal benefits, quinces and gooseberries in syrup, followed by conserves of cherries, barberries, roses, and violets. To make conserve strawburrs, take a quart of strawberries, pick them clean, and wash them. Boil them over a soft fire and strain them, and put as much sugar as the weight of them, and boil them again till they be incorporated. Then put it in glasses. The virtue of this is good against a hot liver or hot burning of the stomach, or in the fervent heat of an ague. Some make them of clear sugar, some of honey clarified, some with honey and sugar together. Honey is more wholesome, though it be not so toothsome. This receipt is concerned with both virtue, the medicinal efficacy of the conserve, and flavor, whether or not the sweet strawberries are toothsome, delectable, pleasing to the palate. Fresh strawberries were thought to be humorally cold and moist. As John Gerard writes in his Herbal, the ripe strawberries quench thirst, cool heat of the stomach and inflammation of the liver, take away, if they be often used, the redness and heat of the face. And now I know well from the work of Sarah Neville and Rebecca Bushnell and many others, to not put all of my stock in Gerard, the consensus humoral virtue of strawberries tends cooling, moistening, soothing inflammation, calming hot passions. While conserve recipes like this one certainly preserve strawberries in the height of their seasonal ripeness, they are fleeting, fragile fruits. The receipt imagines that the individual consuming the conserve is also seeking other benefits. The recipe invokes two senses of the word conserve or conserve, which is similar to preserve. And Jennifer Park has wonderfully explicated these in her work on discandying in Antony and Cleopatra. At first, conserves ensure the safe storage of food, but in turn, they conserve health by acting as a healing medicine. So preservation and conservation are first meant to be about the body and then secondarily about food. So the conserve strawberries is good against a hot liver, the seat of anger, choler, and yellow bile in the body in humoral medicine. Eating honey sweet strawberry conserve, we are told, will dispel anger by calming the operations of this irritated liver. It will cool agitated tempers. It is also good for pacifying the hot burning of the stomach or the fervent heat of an ague or fever brought on by illness or powerful emotions. Strawberry conserve is a medicament designed to soothe anger, to quell passions of the body, to cool a feverish temper. A cook's choice to sweeten the strawberry conserve with either honey or sugar or a mix of both will simultaneously impact the preparation's flavor and medical properties. Again, geohumoral logic appears, here dictating the properties of the sweetened conserve. Will the sugar or honey best amplify the healing properties of the locally harvested strawberries, wild or from a garden? The recipe instructs that honey is more wholesome or more efficacious in regulating the body's humors, though it be not so toothsome or as powerfully sweet as sugar. Although sugared confections were prized in late 16th century England, long-held ideas about local and imported foods shaped perceptions about the virtues of foods and which were wholesome or healthful. There is a long history of using honey in medicines and foods in England. Abala writes that before sugar came on the scene, honey was probably the only intensely sweet substance most Europeans were familiar with. Fitzpatrick writes that it was praised for its medicinal powers and for being nutritious. Joan Thirsk writes that honey was cultivated in hives and may also have been wild or found, but the arrival of sugar in bulk as an item of trade in the early modern period opened a new era, and writers were soon claiming that sugar had ousted honey. It then went along with the opinion that sugar was a healthier food than honey. And I think that's later in the 17th century that shift really kicks in. Examining Charles Butler's 1609 Bee Treatise, The Feminine Monarchy, Keith Botelho writes that in addition to honey's many virtues, it also keepeth all things uncorrupt. So even in isolation, honey conserves. Sugar was also treasured as a medicine for the profound impact it has on the body, and also prized for its ability to preserve foodstuffs from rot and decay. But sugar was not English like honey. In the later decades of the 16th century and the early decades of the 17th century, when Shakespeare was writing Othello, and this manuscript recipe for strawberry conserve was in circulation use, sugar was imported to England through the trade routes of the Spanish Empire. It was grown, harvested, and processed by enslaved Africans on colonial plantations in the Caribbean, the West Indies, and in Brazil. Here, in the early era of Atlantic chattel slavery and plantation sugar production, here that era intersects with a longstanding suspicion of imported goods that governs a preference for honey over sugar. Shahani writes that sweetness itself, both in lexical and affective terms, evolves in the 17th century in relation to these trajectories of sugar. Okay. When I prepared a conserve of strawberries for the first time, I used honey, and I've also tested it with sugar, and I have both here today. So here's what I did. I prepared a test plate and sterilized a jar. Then I washed, destemmed, and quartered the strawberries. I simmered them in a pot with water until they softened a bit. I poured off the water and then roughly mashed the strawberries. After setting up my candy thermometer, I combined the strawberries and honey in a heavy-bottomed saucepan. I cooked them, stirring constantly until the thermometer read 220 Fahrenheit, and when I ran a spoon along the bottom of the pan, the jam did not immediately flood back in. When I prepared the recipe again with sugar, I followed the same process as I did with honey. I've made other strawberry jams in my kitchen, both modern small batch jams and 17th century strawberry preserves, and none has filled my kitchen with the scent of flowers like this preserve when it is prepared with honey. I cannot say if the sweet and wholesome flavors of the honey in the preserve that I prepared necessarily cooled my liver or soothed my unbalanced humors, but it was a distinctly multi-sensory experience. Wildflower flavors mixed with the familiar taste of strawberries on my tongue. In the sugar batch, interestingly, the inherent floral flavors of the strawberries come through more strongly than the flavors of the sweetener. A few recipes in MS Codex 823 seem to have been copied from John Partridge's 1573 printed cookery book, The Treasury of Commodious Conceits and Hidden Secrets. And this really helps me root this manuscripts to the late 16th century. The recipe for strawberry conserves bears a resemblance, but diverges significantly in its use of sweeteners. To make conserve of strawberries with the virtue of the same, chapter 30. Take strawberries, 1 quart clean picked and washed, set them on the fire till they be soft, strain them, put thereto 2 times as much sugar in powder as weight of the strawberries. Let them sieve till the sugar be incorporated with the strawberries. Put it in a glass or earthen pot well glazed. The virtue of the same. The conserve of strawberries is good against a hot liver or burning of the stomach, and especially in the fervent heat of an ague. Although the recipe describes a similar preparation and espouses related medicinal virtues, there is not a drop of honey to be found. Perhaps the compiler of MS Codex 823 did, in fact, actually prepare strawberry conserve. Instead of following Partridge's instructions to the letter, the compiler may have used their own geohumorally inflected medicinal knowledge to substitute honey for sugar. While we will never be sure if the compiler actually did this, was this person a recipe user as well as a collector? At the very least, there is evidence on paper, and it adds to the matrix of virtues associated with strawberry conserve. A local strawberry, a local honey, a palliative to anger. Juxtaposing the strawberry conserve and the strawberry stitched on the handkerchief invites a new perspective on Othello's jealous rage. If the return of the handkerchief might quell his groundless suspicions, the recipe raises that tantalizing possibility that if only Othello had eaten some strawberry conserves, he might have calmed his rage by rebalancing his humors. Or perhaps the handkerchief has a metonymic relationship to a strawberry medicament, the virtues of the fruit conveyed by the threads dyed in conserved mummy. Othello's anger, his hot blood, is, after all, understood as a humoral imbalance. As Desdemona puts it, He is in his favor, as in his humor altered. As Iago puts it, 'tis but his humor. Cooking this recipe for strawberry conserve makes the stitched strawberries jump off the handkerchief and become foodstuffs again, and thus a potential remedy for Othello's collar. The culinary and medicinal properties of strawberries combined with honey or sugar are also a part of the magic in the handkerchief's web. So in conclusion, what I'm doing in this case study and in my larger project pushes the question of material texts very, very far into the edible. I couldn't have learned what I learned about Othello and this strawberry conserve without spending time at my stove and tasting what I cooked with berries, honey, and sugar. I anticipate that readers of Shakespeare in the Kitchen will have their own specific experiences if they read this chapter, recall the play, and prepare the recipes. Those experiences will necessarily be different than my own. And I hope that they will incite new ways of thinking about Othello and about this handkerchief. I might also learn something new from the sneaky act of reunion happening at this moment in this room. MS Codex 823, Othello, and Strawberry Conserve are all here. There's a chance that sticky sweet strawberries have been in the same room as this manuscript before. As I said, I think the compiler may have experimented with honey and sugar in the kitchen, or at least considered the recipe's virtues and documented their own enhancements to Partridge's version on paper. I'm curious about what bringing the conserve and the manuscript together might yield today beyond peril to collections. So what happens when I stop speaking and we taste some strawberry conserve remains an open question. Thank you.
Thank you. And those of you in the room will get to try these in a little bit. Those of you on Zoom, sorry, should have come in person today. Thanks for that great talk. And the floor is open for questions. If you're on Zoom and would like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function to ask your question live. Whitney?
Thank you. That was really great. I'm wondering about the word conserve and conservation. I just wanted to hear you say more about it, because there's this fascinating connection between the use of mummies as the dye, silk, the word conserving in terms of like preserving the strawberries, but there's also, I haven't read Miriam Jacobson's article on mummies, but so I'm not familiar very much with that work, but of course it's used as a body preservative, nullification. And there's like a sense that the honey is like healthful, but then there's like death also. And so I'm just wondering like what more could be made with this notion of like conserve, and also the history of conserves, preserves. Seems really rich in your talk.
Miriam's piece just came out, so and it's definitely a good place. Like, it's a really great Mummy 101 for anyone who needs it. And I hadn't really thought about honey as a part of the mummification process, but now you're making me think like I need to make me think about ways to kind of bring that back in as another loop in what's going on in this kind of geohumoral loop between the play and these different contexts that I'm running it through. And recipes that call for, they use conserve and preserve in some ways interchangeably for the specific category of medicaments where sugar is one of the key ingredients. And Jennifer Park's piece on discandying and candying and Antony and Cleopatra is something I come back to a lot for thinking about that. But basically, first and foremost, the use is to preserve the health of the body, and then secondarily, it's to preserve the fragility of the fruit. And I think my instinct coming to preserves was that like the fruit preservation would be the first order, but in fact, and which I really learned from Jennifer Park, the preserving of health is like the number one, like the leading definition when people see a preserve or a conserve. So you're preserving this like vegetal fruit matter, or human matter in the case of mummy, with the idea that it's going to bring health to the body. And that's in the way it intersects in Othello with this kind of all-consuming appetite that I'm tracing through the play.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm not remembering exactly how the story of the handkerchief comes out in Othello. And I'm wondering who hears him talking about it and whether he had ever told Desdemona about it when giving her the handkerchief. She doesn't seem to know about it, which is weird.
Yeah, Desdemona does not know the handkerchief story until this particular moment in the play. And it's not one of Othello's like best crafted stories, and we know he's a good storyteller. He doesn't kind of tell it chronologically. He tells the first part, and then he goes into this whole other part, which is the part with the mummy. And in some ways it sounds like a very real story, and in some ways it within the world of this play, and in some ways it sounds like a story that's being kind of made up to add like additional enchantment to this love token that was already an important love token in their relationship. So it's knowledge that Desdemona does not have until that exact moment in Act 3.
And so you would think that, you know, the moment in which he gives it to her and stresses that she should never put it anywhere away from herself.
Yeah.
She might ask why, you know, because maybe there were other love tokens and so on. So, you know, and I haven't read all of the criticism about whether Othello is an upstanding, honest person apart from making up the story of the handkerchief. But it just strikes me as kind of a weak point.
Yeah, it's a wild moment in the play where suddenly this one particular item takes on so much resonance. And so there's what's going on in the actual play with that. And then in the critical tradition, it's become a flashpoint for so many different things. And I cut all this stuff about all the really wonderful scholars who work on the textile work around. Like I got Ian Smith and I got Anne Breen in there, but like there's like a whole other like textualities. Susan Fry's work has been really important for me thinking through some of that. Yeah, there's a whole other part about the cloth itself that will eventually be at least noted in the chapter, if not explicated fully.
Yeah. Jerry?
Thank you, Marissa. Thinking back on Wendy Wall's book that you cited, if I'm remembering correctly, one of her main points, not the main point, is that in these cookery books and these domestic science books, if you will, you have evidence of a kind of scientific experimentation going on by women at the domestic level.
Absolutely.
I couldn't help but noticing that Partridge's recipe for the conserve has twice as much sugar as your manuscript does. That seems to go unspoken about in your recipe. I'm wondering if it is derived from Partridge, do you have thoughts about what's going on there? I mean, the sugar has a very, very important role in establishing the efficacy of the conserve, but somebody along the way has had the quantity. And so what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the other recipe that I think is copied from Partridge in this volume is for orange suckets or preserved orange peels. And I'm writing about that recipe in my chapter on Much Ado About Nothing, which is a whole bunch of orange rhetoric in it. And that one is much more clearly copied. And this one is similar but altered. So I think because of the alterations, I have a case for the compiler actually reading Partridge and making changes, possibly based on practice. So that goes absolutely with Wendy's argument that like these are places of experimentation and thinking through the world, often by women in domestic settings. Twice as much sugar is really playing into the class and trade dynamics of these books and how they're working. So could maybe the compiler is using less because that's appropriate for that particular household or for a vision of health that that household has or that individual has. But there's also something so aspirational about these recipes that call for these just phenomenally expensive amounts of sugar. And that runs through to like the later 17th century. John Locke says the pancakes have to have half a nutmeg in them to be good. And that's a really expensive nutmeg. And some of that comes back to my earliest conversations about this material with Peter Stallybrass, where we were talking about where he's like, Marissa, no one made these recipes. Even when they were collecting them to aspire to gather all this knowledge together, but they weren't really going to shell out for that much sugar. And I still hear that from Peter, even though I think people were actually using these a little bit more, but maybe they were doing something like halving partridge, right, as a way to make it possible in their household.
And the honey substitution.
The honey would be much cheaper, which is also is hard for the mind today to think about really rich.
So we know what those prices would be. Sort of much.
Yeah. I can't riff them off the top of my head, but they would be
Thank you, Marissa. This is such a brilliant talk. I mean, since Ian Smith's brilliant article, we know about the blackness of handkerchief, but we couldn't quite know what to do with the strawberry still, right? Is it virginity? Is it blood? But we're making it's reading given that in relation to Othello. And one thing, I don't know if you mentioned, but the blackness of the handkerchief, the mummy, was used for epilepsy, pharmaceutical. And the person in the play with epilepsy is Othello, who has that, right? So there is another connection there, how the mummy and the strawberries healing qualities are combined when we think it with Othello. I think my question is like maybe pushing it a little further, thinking the use of handkerchief not only in terms of Othello's humors, because Othello refuses the handkerchief, saying this napkin is too small, implying he's growing horns. If he accepted the handkerchief, nothing would have happened. But at the same time, Desdemona is the user of handkerchief. So what about Desdemona's humor? Once handkerchief is gone, Othello calls Desdemona, your hands are wet, my lady. So Desdemona becomes almost this leaky vessel for Othello. The way, Othello's contradiction, my mother gave it to my father, then at the end of it, he says, my father gave it to my mother. So that's the contradiction that Othello makes up the story, but at the same time evokes the question, who is user? The mother or the father? So using this as an excuse, I'm just like thinking Desdemona as a user of handkerchief and Desdemona's humor, the way Cassio also cleans his beard, whatever that means, with handkerchief. So there are other humoral bodies in the play that put in relation to handkerchief. So I'm just curious about what you have to say about handkerchief in relation to other characters.
That's great. Okay, I've got so much to think with here. So I didn't get in the part about the epilepsy and the mummy as treatment for epilepsy. Also, honey was treatment for epilepsy too. So that's a kind of another kind of circle here. And I also didn't get to talk about Bianca copying the handkerchief. So there's like two versions of the handkerchief that are floating around in the play at one point, because there's the copy that's been made by Bianca, and what is she copying when she's doing that? And Thomas Ward invited me to think about like the alteration of the partridge recipe with the copy of the handkerchief, which is something else I want to think about, but I haven't totally thought through. I wonder what I want to think more about what this does to Desdemona's humors and what it does to her humoral disposition. And she's so associated with weeping and with kind of like wetness, and she's in a kind of world with the willow tree song, which is a kind of water. There's all this like water stuff going on with Desdemona, so that's where I'd go to think more about that, and I really appreciate you inviting me to do so.
Let's go to Zoom. Diane, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi from Colorado. Thanks so much, Marissa. I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about your really provocative title, Shakespeare in the Kitchen, and maybe just work through the kind of methodological implications of that, especially from like a feminist perspective, or just thinking about Natasha Korda's Shakespeare's Laundry List, the kind of like pushing back on the binary of like the domestic and the literary, women's work and men's work, and just like how you're thinking about this, and like kind of where you'd like to see that go next. Thanks so much.
So I wanted to, instead of using and, to use in, and I wanted to talk about the kitchen instead of talking about food, or like instead of it being like Shakespeare and food or something like that as a title of the book. So in was important for me, and there's something there about like dwelling and cohabitating that I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm trying to write about in my introduction to the book, because that's always, of course, the part that one writes last. Right, what you give first comes last. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be living with my work, in the sense that I'm like eating my work and like cooking my work in my home kitchen next to like all of the other things I'm doing in my home kitchen. And in some ways, I find it truly delightful. And in some ways, it becomes like a problem that even my home kitchen is not a space where I'm not working for my job. And so I think that there's a piece of feminist recovery work that I believe in that runs alongside Korda's work on saying the domestic is intellectual, the laundry lists are an important part of the archive, the recipes are an important part of the archive, and there's a kind of valorization to what I'm doing by saying like, no, we will cook them, even if Ken Albala says we won't learn anything from cooking them. I'm going to try to cook them in my kitchen. But there's a kind of uncanniness that comes with that too, where a lot of things that I might want to keep cordoned off about my life and my work become uncordoned off because they're all happening in the same space. So I think there's an almost getting too close that I'm trying to figure out how to inhabit as I continue to do this work. So that's a kind of messy answer, but that's the answer that I've got for now.
Diane, actually, her question kind of prompts some of what I've been thinking about methodology. I thought your section on methodology was really interesting. And at one point you kind of, you sort of offhand said, well, we're used to putting on a production of Othello in 2025, no one thinks twice about it. But it did strike me that like a lot of what you're doing it's very similar to debates around original practices performance, right?
Yeah.
And you did hear in the kind of first wave, say, of the Globe Theater, this idea that we were going to discover things that could not be discovered otherwise, except by doing original practices.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your take on kind of like that, that connection. And because, I can't remember who it was who said honey was probably the sweetest thing that people in Europe had tasted before.
Yeah.
Sure. So the problem is, even if you could get those wild strawberries, and the honey that would have been different, no doubt, because the flowers are different.
Yep.
Even if you get all that, of course, like you've eaten tons of stuff that have changed your reaction to sweetness compared to, I mean, like I like once you eat candy, like modern candy, like everything else feels less sweet. So that's true also of the original practices, right? Like you can go to the Globe, you see an original practices thing, but you've come from like the pub down the street that's serving you crisps in a pack. So that's one question I had about methodology, and then secondly is I'm curious about your feelings about the Shakespearean cookbook as a genre. Brienne Weber has a piece in a special issue I'm doing, which is why I read it, that's coming out soon, on the kind of some of the Shakespearean cookbooks that are in the Folger collection, and the politics around their creation is fairly unsavory, most of it. These are kind of like for wealthy white women's clubs, kind of fundraising for their groups. They often have explicitly racist stuff in the preambles of the recipes and things like that. So I also was wondering how do you think about the genre you're writing and its own history and what you want to do with it.
I need to read that essay. I need to read that essay and talk to Brianna about that, because I have read some of the more recent Shakespearean cookbooks, but I haven't gone on the deep dive of all of the Shakespearean cookbooks and like the longer history of that genre. So that's so what I'll say about the most recent ones is that they are interested in the food references in Shakespeare, but not in the culinary history so much. The ones that are like in the last 15 years. So they'll take like an ingredient like a capon or something like that, or venison, or but they won't like refer to the historical archive of what those recipes were like. And that seems fine for a certain kind of publishing segment, but I haven't, the most recent ones haven't been super politicized in the ways that the archive that I guess Brianna's been working with have. But the other piece about like, I was thinking when I wrote that sentence, I was like, well, there's the whole original practices debate, but I'm just not going to flag that right here and right now. I've been reading a lot in performance studies about this. And what's interesting for me is, this is a section I cut out of this talk. Diana Taylor's book, The Archive and the Repertoire, has been really useful for me thinking through a lot of things about performance. But one thing it does is it puts cooking and recipes in the like repertoire of embodied knowledge and juxtaposes them against the archive, saying that they could be perhaps a place of another history of embodied practice and performance in the Americas. And the archive is kind of laden with the colonial and that it's a really useful work, but what I'm looking at is an archive that's like a partial record of what was this embodied repertoire. So performance studies, like food studies and performance studies, needs to have like a bigger conversation about this, more than like I can fully be the person to have. But coming from like recipes and working on drama, I think that there's a lot for me to continue learning from performance studies and to learning from those debates around original practices, because there might be something that you can learn. I think there probably is something you can learn by putting on the doublet, right? But
what's interesting is I feel like in that world, like the guy you quote, Alballo, no one's saying that in the world. No one is saying like, unless you do everything exactly in a historically authentic way and perform in a performance of Shakespeare, you can't learn anything. It's the opposite, right? People are saying you can learn things through performance. It doesn't, and that the original practice is seen as a kind of like, can become a kind of fetish that does not actually reveal much, right? So it's just interesting. They seem very related because both are working with scripts for performances.
Yes,
right?
They are.
Where we don't have the performances, the historic performances. But like they seem to have taken two very different paths, which is interesting to me, like, and why that would be, right?
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, because I mean, we have like interesting remnants here, right? We have like the quarto of Othello out, and we have a manuscript recipe book, but we don't have Othello, and we don't have, well, we have a version of Strawberry Concert, but we don't have the 8th century one. And we can't get it even if we try.
I'll read a question from the Zoom chat that's sort of, I think, on a similar subject. This was written by Jeff Barton. Jeff writes, to what extent do you think Shakespeare might have been aware or unaware of the subtleties of your insights into food items like strawberries? And how might this affect your/our view now? Is there a possible disjunction?
So the way Shakespeare is using mentions of food and mentions of culinary practice seems like the same way, like if I was going to talk to you about Diet Mountain Dew, you might have associations based on like Diet Mountain Dew and right-wing culture, like current, right? You might be able to pick that up as an offhand thing. Maybe not. Maybe if I said Tide Pod Challenge, we would think it might register for you as something about like in our current food
You're trying to calibrate the generational knowledge, but you've got a wide spread. I've got a wide spread. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other things, but like there's so many things that are like you know it's like if you're eating today, you would know familiar things from what you're seeing stocked at stores and from what you're seeing going to restaurants and from what like food trends are floating around different places. Like for a while, everyone was talking about the sheet pan baked feta that was a TikTok recipe success. Like there's a lot of things that are resonances that people tend to know. So I think Shakespeare was very aware of the food culture in which he was embedded, and I think a lot of that is actually pretty opaque to us. But because of the intense work done on Shakespeare from some of the earliest systematic pre-digital humanities kind of indexing projects on all the food in Shakespeare and all the animals, the birds, the plants, we can really use things like a dictionary and use things like searching to pull out the words and looking at them in context, we can start to kind of get back to this. So I think Shakespeare was aware of strawberries as a fragile, fleeting fruit because of some references to strawberries in Richard III. I think he was aware of their potential relationship to like a cooling humoral temperament. I think I'm pretty sure about those things from the way he uses it. And beyond that, a lot of this is my own, right? A lot of this is my own, like, what can we do with the Shakespeare text that we have? But I think he was really immersed in his food culture, and Abala's piece on Shakespeare's Culinary Metaphors and that Fitzpatrick book are like just wonderful for what they start to do, which is different than what I'm doing, but really, I mean, surely Falstaff is eating capons like that means
so many
capons. He's not choosing that random. I mean, in other words, the kid's choosing capon instead of something else.
Yeah,
right.
And the capon, because you've castrated the rooster, it is like the plumpest, fattest, juiciest roasting bird that you can eat, unless you have access to turkeys, which are so new in the cuisine. So he's eating like the festive bird, and he's eating them in they're known to be fat, and they're fat because they've been castrated in this state of arrested development. And this is what you need if you want to have eggs and you want to have roasting chickens. You need capons. You need something to do with them. And Falstaff is bonkers for them, and that's something that my chapter on capons really gets into.
Also, if we think like what changes Shakespeare does to handkerchief from the Italian original.
Yes.
Only handkerchief where Shakespeare adds all the layers.
Yeah.
And when in the original it's stolen by Iago's son, here it is like dropped when trying to heal this Othello's headache. So there is definitely a deliberate addition to the original story of handkerchief.
Yes. Yes. It becomes so much more enriched. So the strawberry is choice. It's a distinct choice that there are strawberries, and that's described as spotted in the weave of it. Yeah.
Two more questions from Zoom. One from Cara Grimaldi asks, how much are ideas around food in the early modern period a continuation of medieval ideas about food? And she's thinking about the Holy Feast and Holy Fast, Caroline Walker Bynum.
Yes.
And then the other question from Zoom is a follow-up to Jerry's question about sugar. Bianca Calabresi asks, have you compared the recipes I think with sugar versus honey in terms of stickiness, gelling, mouthfeel, etc.? Yeah, I guess we are.
Yes, I have.
Plays a particular role, especially with a low acidity fruit like the strawberry.
Yes. Okay. So I will take Bianca's question first and say the version prepared with sugar is more gelatinous, and it has a stickier mouthfeel, and it came together more quickly. Zach's trying to see if they'll move around. Neither of them really moves much, but the sugar one is stickier and tackier. So it is absolutely doing something chemically with the strawberries that the honey does differently. Yeah. And I do not we just get wholesome and toothsome, right? This idea of wholesome being good for the body and toothsome is particularly talking about sweet, but I might think about toothsome and texture. I'm not totally sure if toothsome is a texture word as much as it's a flavor word, but it might be given that it's called toothsome, right? We give it that the word's toothsome. So I should think about that some more. To the medieval and early modern question. So I think cookbooks are inherently pretty conservative and pretty retrospective in what they are doing, which is how, even though physicians in early 17th century London are moving towards Paracelsian medicine and are looking at are kind of trying to shake up the humor of the body theory, that is dominating in the recipe collections still and continues to dominate. So what might be happening in the apothecary and what's moving through the household recipe manuscripts are at a historic remove. And so a lot of practices and ingredients are also really are fairly continuous. However, the changes in trade in the early 17th century really start to transform what people are doing. So Amy Tigner has written a great piece about how all of these fruits that were preserved in vinegar in like circa 1600 are getting preserved in sugar by 1650. So you see these kind of real shifts with the cheapness of sugar because of chattel slavery, where that gets picked up. In English recipe books, I was messaging with Dot Porter about this actually. Rice is around in medieval cookbooks. It's around in early Renaissance cookbooks because of the Carolina rice kitchen and enslaved Africans farming rice in the Carolinas in the later 17th century. There's so much more rice in the cookbooks. There's just so much more rice in the recipes circulating around. So they're retrospective, but they also do pick up on these trends as they kick in, and you'll kind of see just more of what people want. So in France around 1650, La Varenne publishes his sort of treatise on what new French cooking should look like. And that's where we get like the mother sauces and the cabbage soup that tastes like cabbage only and not like mace and nutmeg and all of that stuff. So that trend really starts in France in the 1650s, and it doesn't hit England in a watershed way until the 18th century, mid 18th century. So if we're talking about like pre-1750, English cuisine is doing a lot of the same things across the medieval and early modern. You're just seeing ingredients that are coming into the country in greater volumes really start to kick up in the recipe books, but a lot of other kind of sensibilities around taste and what you're supposed to put out together, and a lack of division between sweet and savory, that really continues across the early modern, the kind of Renaissance medieval divide, and even into the 18th century.
This is great. Thank you. Wonderful discussion. Maybe more of a question about the recipe books and Shakespeare, because
sure,
I'm not up on all everybody else's, but Roger and I were just teaching an hour ago and talking about something that isn't really what you were talking about, but I think maybe makes me think about talking about sort of digest and distillation and essence and spirit. And I guess the process of cooking that in your recipe that you're talking about isn't a creation of an essence of strawberry.
No.
The preservation thing, but I don't know if those metaphors of making the essence of a thing, of a flower, of a fruit are relevant here at all.
Rosewater is a big one that you used.
They are, and in my chapter on the sonnets and on A Midsummer Night's Dream, get into that. So in there, I'm looking at these like very, I'm looking at syrup of violets, which is it's not a distillation. That's just the like perfume of the violet or the perfume of the rose in rose water, but it's like a very, very basic preparation of flowers infused with sugar and water. And simples could be made that way, right?
And it's kind of a metaphor for a kind of reading practice.
Yeah.
Of, extracting and even commonplace and getting to the essence of something or the spirit of something. Yeah,
absolutely. And using that phrase simple is to try to keep it as simple as possible. Like these are ideas of like getting the kind of purest essences of the ingredients and in the medicinal culture, so then they can be like applied appropriately to like pinpoint, target the humoral aspects of the body that are trying to be treated. So like your commonplace might be like the exact thing you need from your reading to treat yourself. Right, just like the rose water or the syrup of violets might be the thing that you need to heal your heartache. Yeah.
Thanks.
Jerry, again.
Yeah, thank you again. The question is about the cookery books themselves. Looking very quickly on the table, they seem to be in the same hand. The example you showed earlier of "this is not a good cream" is a different hand, seems to be a much later hand. What are the signs of use in the books that we have? How are they layered? You know, between the copying of the recipe and "this is not a good cream," there's presumably a good long period of time elapsing. I mean, I'm not a paleographer, so I may be wrong there. Does the person who is writing the recipes ever correct them or annotate them, which would show signs of use? So are there notes to self in that? And this is, you know, in a way, it's getting back to the earlier question about experimenting with quantities. So the person who's written this recipe down has already experimented or has already inherited an experimentation. But are other people messing around, thinking them through them? You know, which we have Shakespeare in the kitchen. Are there material traces that tell us these books have been in the kitchen?
Yes. So there's a great I'm completely blanking on the names associated with this book. There's a fantastic manuscript cookbook in the New York Public Library that has a spoon print in it. So that one really points us to that particular book, having been in the kitchen, and the name will come back to me. So there are so many different signs of intertextual work. Like in this case, it's written in the main hand in with the recipe. So it seems to be from that act of compiling or sitting down to put the scattered notes into the recipe book or into the commonplace book, as this one is. And I found that Elaine Long's work on this is really spot on, in that a lot of these manuscripts have a starter set where someone has gathered a whole lot of material from other printed works, familial cookbooks, letters, and other gathering, sat down and done a beautiful fair copy. And that beautiful fair copy is the core of the early collection. Then that beautiful fair copy sometimes has an index, sometimes not. And it then will get edited with annotations as that book is in use. So it might never get used. So there might never be a probatum S, like it is proven, or a this is not a good cream added by a later user. And sometimes we get these signs of crossing out an experimentation in the book, sometimes as those books are being prepared to be used by someone else to copy things out of. There's a lot of signs, there's a lot of things crossed out, there's a lot of alterations of quantities, there's letters, there's recipes that were sent through the mail where you'll get a first recipe and then almost a second recipe that's like, this is how we actually make it at home. My wife has now told me, and I've added this to my letter. So they're really dynamic in what they're doing. There are a lot of other people in the kitchen with these books, or in the process of working with these books, who are kind of layering this stuff. And some of the books we can date, like the book I that from this collection 644 that I write about for the American Contact volume. That book was used for over 100 years within the same family. It's my grandmama, Lady Franklin's receipt book on the inside cover. So the person who wrote that annotation is placing it way back in the family history. Yeah.
Time maybe for one last question. Ariel, you seemed. Well, in that case, we'll save time because I'd like you to look at the books, but I'd like you then to not look at the books while you're trying the food.
Yes.
And but do look at the books. Also, that Othello is one of my favorite books that we have because it's Frances Wolferston, her copy of Othello, and she's annotated and made a little bit of a critical comment about the play. So, but thank you for a terrific talk. And now we get to try the food.
Thank you.